Watch closely. What you just witnessed isn't simply a reaction to a Supreme Court ruling. It's a real-world demonstration of how political momentum can shift faster than any legal map anticipates. Every comment, every grassroots effort, every energized voter shows that influence isn't measured by court decisions, but by how citizens respond in real time. The real question now, will this momentum hold, or will it reshape Texas politics entirely before 2026? Keep observing, because the next move could change everything. For days, Texas Governor Greg Abbott had been celebrating the Supreme Court's decision like it was a personal coronation. The ruling allowed Texas' newly drawn redistricting maps to stand. Maps critics said were engineered behind closed doors, strategically cutting minority influence while stacking new GOP-leaning districts like building blocks to Abbott. It wasn't just a legal win, it was fuel-proof in his mind. That Texas was securely his battlefield, and he controlled the terrain. But what Abbott didn't expect was that someone miles away, someone he never saw as a political threat to him, would flip the narrative in a single message that spread across social media faster than his entire victory tour. That someone was Jasmine Crockett. The moment her response went live, nothing about Abbott's celebration felt stable anymore. The smug confidence, the victory posts, the talking points all suddenly rattled by one warning that landed harder than anything Abbott's opponents had thrown at him all year. Because Crockett didn't just criticize the ruling, she framed it as political Russian roulette. And unlike Abbott, she was speaking directly to the people the maps were designed to box out. The same people who, historically, could turn a quiet midterm election into a shockwave. The shift began quietly. No press conference. No dramatic video. Just Crockett responding to the Supreme Court news with a message so clean and sharp it hit like a courtroom objection that everyone stopped to hear. She didn't moan about unfairness. She didn't panic. She didn't even sound defeated. Instead, she treated Abbott's victory like a trap he didn't realize he walked into. Her tone was almost surgical. If Republicans think a manipulated map guarantees their win, they're underestimating Texans, and that was the moment everything flipped. Because Crockett wasn't reacting emotionally. She was exposing a pattern. A repeating political equation Texas leaders have ignored for years. Every time power brokers tried to redraw lines to shrink turnout, marginalized voters turned out stronger than next cycle. The numbers were already whispering it. Shrinking margins in suburban districts that used to be automatic wins, increased turnout from young voters. College towns trending bluer. South Texas becoming unpredictable. Cities like Dallas, Houston, Austin sending out waves of new voters who didn't care about old political lines. Abbott saw a map. Crockett saw a warning. And her audience saw something else entirely. A spark within hours. Her notifications turned into a flood of comments that didn't look like random social media chatter. They looked like people who were activated. We support you, Jasmine. The power is with thee. People. Maps drawn in back rooms won't survive. Sunlight. This time, we're voting differently. These weren't the comments of frustrated spectators. They were the comments of people ready to treat Abbott's win like a challenge. And in Texas politics, challenges spread quickly. While Abbott posted victory graphics, Crockett's warning circulated through group chats, activist pages, and local community threads like an alarm bell. People weren't just sharing the message. They were adding their own stories, their own anger, their own determination. This wasn't a politician complaining. This was a politician mobilizing. And it caught the attention of strategists quietly, nervously, because they saw the same math Crockett saw. Voter behavior doesn't always respond to suppression the way legislators expect. Sometimes it backfires spectacularly, turning unsafe districts into battlegrounds overnight. Meanwhile, Abbott's team kept framing the ruling as a knockout punch, but the energy online suggested something entirely different. Texans, especially Black, Latino, and younger voters weren't discouraged. They were insulted, and insult is fuel. The more Abbott gloated, the more Crockett's message spread by the time the political talk shows began discussing the ruling. A new question was taking shape in the background. What if Abbott's Supreme Court win just awakened the voters he hoped would stay quiet? And another, even more unexpected question started bubbling up. Is Jasmine Crockett setting the stage for a statewide run? Whispers, rumors, nothing confirmed, but the timing felt too sharp to ignore. A rising star calling out the governor's victory like a long-term miscalculation. Strategists could feel it. Abbott supporters could feel it. Crockett's followers definitely felt it. Abbott won a case. Crockett won momentum, and politically. Momentum is far more dangerous because the map may stand, but maps don't vote. Texans do, and this was only the beginning of the shift in tone, energy, and pressure that Abbott never anticipated when he celebrated that ruling. As Greg Abbott continued celebrating his Supreme Court victory, the political atmosphere in Austin shifted in a way nobody on his team saw coming. They expected Democrats to panic or complain. They expected activists to be discouraged. What they didn't expect was Jasmine Crockett, treating the ruling like the spark that ignites a sleeping wildfire. Because, while Abbott's legal win froze district lines on paper, Crockett's message unfroze something much more powerful: public emotion and Texas emotion. Once activated, moves like a storm. Her warning didn't sound like a partisan reaction. It sounded like someone reading out the consequences of a decision before the decision-makers even processed them themselves. She didn't say the ruling was bad. She didn't say Texas was doomed. She simply pointed out the obvious truth that Abbott pushed aside in his celebration. Maps don't vote. Texans do. That line alone hit harder than any campaign ad could have. Clean, sharp, impossible to refute. And that's exactly why it spread. Reporters on social media clipped the quote. Activist pages highlighted it. Voting rights groups reposted it with graphics. Even some moderate Texas voters, usually silent, rarely emotional, shared it with captions like, "This right here. No rage. No hysteria. Just clarity." Abbott's team began noticing the shift. Not because Crockett was shouting, but because the responses were unusually unified. When Texans with different backgrounds react the same way, strategists pay attention. For years, Republicans had been relying on the idea that redistricting could harden their advantage. But Texas wasn't the Texas of 10 years ago. The suburbs were changing. College enrollment was up. Young Latino voters were registering in higher numbers. And Black voter turnout had surged in the last two midterms. Abbott's map mathematically favored Republicans. Crockett's warning emotionally activated everyone the map tried to weaken. Inside political groups, people didn't sound defeated, they sounded motivated. Elderly voters said they were tired of being ignored. Young voters said this was exactly why voting mattered. Community organizers said they were already planning neighborhood events. Latino voters talked about representation like it was personal. Black voters talked about turnout like it was legacy. The ground energy wasn't red or blue, it was something deeper. Something Abbott's team underestimated: resentment of being treated like pieces on a chessboard. The more Abbott bragged, the angrier people became. Meanwhile, Crockett was doing something Abbott couldn't control. She was building a bridge between outrage and action. Her breakdown of the ruling wasn't emotional. It was factual. She explained the history behind Texas maps. She explained why Black and Latino communities kept getting carved out. She explained how engineered districts eventually collapse once voters feel manipulated. And she explained the part Abbott didn't want to hear. Safe seat stops being safe the second voters decide. They're done being controlled by politicians drawing invisible lines by this point. The conversation had shifted away from the Supreme Court decision entirely. It wasn't about legality, it was about momentum. People weren't arguing about the ruling. They were reacting to the arrogance of Abbott, celebrating like Texans didn't exist. Every political cycle in Texas has a moment that redirects the energy. Sometimes it's a viral clip. Sometimes it's a speech. Sometimes it's a scandal. This time, it was a warning, one powerful enough to make Democrats more energized and Republicans more uneasy. Then came the whispers. Political consultants began asking the same question. Quietly, is Jasmine Crockett thinking about running statewide? Not because she announced anything. She didn't. Not because she hinted anything. She didn't. It was because the reaction to her message looked exactly like the kind of reaction Texas sees when a rising figure steps into a void. People weren't just agreeing with her, they were rallying around her. The comments weren't passive. They were motivational. Jasmine, we got you. Run and we'll show up. Tell us where to be. We're ready. This was the part Abbott's team feared most. Not a lawsuit. Not a speech. Not a viral clip. Momentum. Organic momentum. Momentum that didn't look forced or coordinated or political. Momentum that looked like people deciding on their own that they were tired and ready. Crockett wasn't staging a campaign moment. She was simply telling the truth. But in Texas, truth spoken plainly can reshape an election faster than any map, because maps define districts. But people define movements, and Abbott suddenly found himself at the center of a movement he never intended to create. A movement building around a warning he didn't take seriously. This wasn't a loss he could measure yet, but he could feel it. A win that triggers a backlash isn't a win, it's the first step toward a political disaster. And Crockett had just made sure every Texan paying attention now understood what was really at stake. The political storm around Texas didn't die down after Crockett's warning, it intensified. By the next evening, the state was buzzing with a tension that even national outlets couldn't ignore. Greg Abbott continued celebrating the Supreme Court ruling, repeating it as a victory for order, while conservative commentators framed it as proof that Democrats had lost the map war. But beneath the noise, something quieter and far more dangerous was taking shape. Texas voters weren't responding the way Republicans expected. In Houston's 3rd Ward, community organizers gathered around phones replaying Crockett's live stream. Her tone hadn't been angry, it had been precise, focused, alarmingly realistic. Voters who usually tuned out political talk were repeating the same line. Maps don't vote. People do. And when ordinary Texans start quoting a congresswoman word for it, it's not politics anymore, it's momentum. Across Dallas County, young Latino activists launched spontaneous voter registration drives at campuses and coffee shops, pushing the idea that the Supreme Court ruling wasn't the end of their influence, it was the start of their resistance. One volunteer said she'd never seen so many freshmen asking how to vote early. Her exact words, "People aren't scared. They're irritated." And irritation moves voters. What Abbott called a court victory, Crockett had reframed as a political trigger. And now the trigger had been pulled. Top political analysts started calculating what Crockett meant when she said this could backfire badly in 2026. Her warning wasn't rhetorical, it was data-based. For years, Republicans assumed engineered districts guaranteed long-term safety. But Crockett pointed out a brutal truth. The tighter you draw a district, the faster demographic shifts pressure it. Some of the supposedly safe new GOP seats were already showing shrinking win margins over consecutive election cycles. That is instability. That's erosion. Abbott's allies dismissed this as fear-mongering. But voters didn't seem to agree. Down in San Antonio, barbershops and taquerias began debating the ruling not because people suddenly cared about redistricting law, but because Crockett had connected it to real consequences: school funding, transit access, community representation. When politics becomes personal, it becomes unstoppable. And this time, it was personal for millions. Meanwhile, political strategists noticed something unusual. Crockett's social media comments weren't just supportive, they were mobilizing. "This is the time. We won't sit back. They think we're asleep. Texas is changing faster than they think." These weren't passive messages. They were signals. Greg Abbott had won a legal battle. But he might have awakened a voting force that legal maps can't contain inside the Texas Republican Party. The mood quietly shifted. Publicly, they claimed the ruling secured long-term dominance. Privately, consultants whispered that Crockett had delivered something they feared more than lawsuits' motivation. For years, GOP strategy relied on low Democratic turnout in midterms. Crockett had cracked that pattern in a single viral moment. And then came the part nobody expected. Reporters began circulating rumors that donors, large ones, had reached out to Crockett, asking whether she had considered statewide office: governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general. The speculation spread fast, not because she had announced anything, but because her warning had exposed a vulnerability. Texas Republicans thought they'd buried a politician who can turn a Supreme Court loss into a statewide organizing weapon is a political threat, not in the distant future. But right now, Crockett didn't address the rumors directly. She didn't need to. Her silence only amplified the idea that something bigger might be forming behind the scenes. On conservative radio, hosts mocked the idea of her running statewide, but their tone cracked whenever they talked about turnout. If young voters show up, one commentator admitted, the math changes. He said it once. He didn't repeat it. Back in Washington, Crockett doubled down. She released a short video emphasizing that engineered maps cannot protect weak ideas, and that suppression is loud, but democracy is louder when people are pushed. Within hours, the clip crossed 1 million views, boosted by Texans who felt like she was speaking directly to them. Greg Abbott didn't respond to the video. His office issued a brief statement about moving forward with the implementation process. But the political class noticed something subtle. Abbott didn't repeat the word victory, not once. As if saying it again might sound hollow. The Supreme Court had given him a win on paper. Voters were giving Crockett something far more consequential: energy. And energy is contagious. Texas wasn't looking like a state where Republicans had secured their future. It looked like a state where they had underestimated their opposition at the exact wrong moment. And for the first time in years, national strategists whispered a phrase that hadn't been spoken seriously in a while. Texas could swing if someone lights the match. Crockett hadn't just lit it. She'd dropped it on dry grass. The energy Crockett had sparked didn't fade as Texas settled into the evening. Abbott's office tried to maintain the narrative of control, issuing statements about legal victories, touting procedural wins, and framing the redistricting decision as a long-term guarantee of Republican dominance. But the ground reality told a different story. Crockett's warning had been more than words. It was a blueprint for mobilization. Communities previously considered apathetic now buzzed with conversations about representation, power, and agency. Her livestream had turned a Supreme Court decision, something distant and legalistic, into a tangible moment of consequence for real people, connecting policy to daily lives. Texans were no longer silent spectators. They were participants. They were activated. The ripple effect grew overnight. Social media threads exploded with discussions about voter registration drives, local candidate endorsements, and grassroots organizing. Every corner of Texas seemed to echo with the same message Crockett had delivered. Maps don't vote. Texans do. Volunteers shared strategies for ensuring that historically suppressed voices were not just heard, but counted. Even suburban districts, previously assumed safe for Republicans, were starting to show evidence of shifting sentiment in local party data and campaign monitoring. Crockett didn't appear to be campaigning. She was strategically elevating awareness. Every analysis she shared, every community call to action she highlighted, resonated with voters. And, as the narrative gained traction, political operatives noticed something critical. This wasn't temporary anger or reactive outrage. It was sustained momentum. The kind of momentum that shapes election cycles, changes polling baselines, and shifts the perception of invincibility for long-standing power structures. Meanwhile, Abbott's celebratory rhetoric began to falter under the weight of the response. The media, sensing a story far beyond the legal ruling, focused attention on Crockett's ability to turn a judicial decision into an engagement engine. Analysts described it as a masterclass in narrative control, turning the supposed victory of one party into a rallying point for the opposition. Public sentiment didn't just disagree, it reorganized, aligning itself along the precise lines Crockett had highlighted: community, representation, and empowerment. As the days unfolded, local election offices reported surges in voter registration. Volunteers trained newcomers in civic processes, explaining how to navigate polling systems and ensure every vote counted. Youth-led organizations amplified Crockett's message, reaching audiences that traditional campaigns often overlooked. For Abbott, a maps he celebrated on paper became less of a shield and more of a spotlight on vulnerabilities he hadn't accounted for. Every district that had been considered secure was now a potential flashpoint for organized civic response. By the end of the week, Crockett's influence had crystallized into tangible outcomes. Town halls filled beyond expectation, civic education sessions doubled in attendance, and social media activity showed measurable engagement spikes. Texans who had felt disempowered now recognized the power they wielded collectively. The warning had translated into action. The so-called victory that Abbott celebrated was no longer simply about legal lines drawn on paper. It had become a public test of whether engineered political dominance could withstand informed, activated voters. Her approach illustrated a broader truth. Political power is never permanent if the people it governs choose to assert themselves. Crockett's insight that maps do not vote, but people do reverberated through communities and influenced discourse at every level. The long-term effect was undeniable. A single, well-articulated perspective had reshaped public perception, energized grassroots initiatives, and exposed the fragility of a legalistic wind when it clashes with citizen engagement. And for Abbott, it was a lesson he could not ignore. Political dominance in theory does not equate to influence in practice. The energy Crockett cultivated had transformed legal victory into a battlefield of public opinion, demonstrating that organized, informed communities are capable of countering entrenched power even before the next election cycle begins. The Texas redistricting story had evolved into something bigger than procedural outcomes. It became a study in modern political strategy, community empowerment, and the undeniable force of messaging that resonates. Abbott's victory was the spark. Crockett's response was the ignition that lit the broader civic consciousness. And in this moment, the lesson was clear to every political observer: ignoring the people, or underestimating their ability to mobilize, is a risk no legal map can fully protect against.